Thank you, Jane, for agreeing to this interview. Is it possible to begin with just to explain your background and
Mm.
what you do really?
Yeah, yeah, I'm an educational psychologist. I was a Senko and a primary and special school teacher. I actually started my career in education the same year that the Warnock Report was published, which was a very long time ago, 1978. So I've actually worked in education for over 40 years, and I've been an ed psych for 30 years, having come from a background in teaching. I worked for local authorities as an ed psych for most of my career, and then took early retirement and set up my own independent practice. So I'm now an independent educational psychologist working part time because I love applying psychology so much. I can't quite stop to let it go altogether. So I just work part time, and one of the things I do as part of my ed psych work is diagnostic assessments. So that's where I sort of come into the picture here with Patos.
Mm. And also you're involved with SAS, aren't you, in STEC?
Yes, I'm a member of STEC, so I'm a member of the SpLD test evaluation committee. Yes, I am. Yeah, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. So first of all, could you explain what is dynamic assessment?
Yeah, sure. Yes, of course. Yeah. So dynamic assessment is basically an interactive method of assessment. And I guess that's the main way in which it differs from other methods of assessment or other approaches to assessment. When we talk about assessment, when I talk about assessment, certainly I will often talk about assessment paradigms, and a paradigm is really just psychobabble, really, for a set of ideas. But we often talk about norm referenced assessment, criterion referenced assessment, and dynamic assessment. Criterion referenced assessment and norm referenced assessment are similar in that they are both static methods of assessment. So when you are engaged in that method of assessment, you must follow the sort of set of instructions. You can't intervene. You have to take as the answer that the individual gives. In contrast, dynamic assessment is, as I've said, interactive. And so the assessor is able to actively intervene in the assessment, because what we're interested in is in dynamic assessment is what the pupil, what the learner can do with support. The other essential characteristic, I guess, of dynamic assessment is that we look at the products, the processes of learning, not the products. And by processes, I mean the sort of cognitive thinking skills. Sometimes they're called abilities, cognitive abilities, that underpin a lot of our learning rather than the products. So thinking skills such as being able to plan, being able to work systematically, being able to restrain your impulsivity, all those kinds of things are thinking skills that are cross curricular. They don't relate to any curriculum area. We can use them in any aspect of the curriculum. And so dynamic assessment is interested in looking at those thinking skills. Dynamic assessment essentially uses what's called a test, teach, test format. So when I'm doing a dynamic assessment, I will look at what the learner can do without support to begin with, because if I intervene too early, I don't know what the learner can do unassisted. So I'm looking at unassisted performance. And when I've got an idea of what the learner can do without assistance, I will then intervene to help and support their thinking skills. And then I would do another test to see, how they've responded to that intervention. So it's that test, teach, test format. So the emphasis is on modifying the learner. And the last important characteristic is that assessment always leads to intervention.
Mm.
It's not these are the scores, this is what the pupil can do, and that's the end of it. There's always a link to intervention because it's based on the idea that our thinking skills, our cognition can change, be modified, and therefore anything I find out in the teach part of this interaction, I will then take forward into the recommendations. So, for example, if I was doing a dynamic assessment test which involved planning and working systematically, and I found that there were certain strategies I could use to help the individual to work more systematically. They would then feed into my recommendations.
Mm. Thank you very much. And these assessment tools are also available for specialist teachers, are they not, to be look at incorporating into their, or some of them are in terms of
Some of them are. I mean, dynamic assessment does require some additional training.
Mm,
Many of the tests are now sort of, floating around and are available. And it is possible also to work dynamically
mm,
with materials that aren't intended to be used dynamically, but can be. So I have a lot of puzzles and games that I have bought from the internet. A lot of people are familiar with the Rush Hour game, which is a game where you have to work out how to get a car out of a car park by moving different vehicles around. And those sorts of games can be used dynamically because you can, look at unassisted performance. You can then intervene to look at the thinking skills required and then do a little
mm.
bit more to see what the pupil can do afterwards. So you can work dynamically with a whole range of materials, but there are tests available and there are published tests available that can be used for dynamic assessment. So it's a real mixture.
Thank you. In February 2025, you'll be offering a webinar where you will discuss using dynamic assessment both in assessment and learning. What are the key topics will you cover, do you think, in this webinar?
So the webinar is entitled Foundations for Effective Learning. And really, it's going to look at two very important foundations for learning: thinking skills and executive function. So in terms of the thinking skills, I'll be saying a little bit about intelligence and IQ testing and try to unpick the difference between cognition and intelligence, because in my opinion, cognition and intelligence are not the same. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I'll talk a lot about what we mean by thinking skills. So we'll look at, I mentioned earlier when I was talking about dynamic assessment, those cognitive abilities, cognitive thinking skills, process skills which underpin our learning. So planning, gathering all the information we need, working systematically, holding things in your working memory, bringing up things from your long-term memory, all those kinds of things are thinking skills which we can use whatever the topic, whether it's a curriculum area or anything else. So I'll certainly be looking in detail at those thinking skills and emphasizing the flexibility of the thinking skills, the fact that we can change and modify people's thinking. It's not fixed. I'll also be talking about executive function. So we'll look at what executive function is and what it involves. Executive function is a bit like your body's air traffic control system. It's what we use to set goals and plan, hold things in our head, and there'll be quite a lot about what executive function is, because again, that's an important foundation for effective learning. And once I've unpicked those two really important concepts, I'll then go on to look at how they might be used and applied in diagnostic assessments. And the emphasis will be on how assessors can use information about cognitive functions and aspects of executive function to inform the cognitive profile part of a diagnostic assessment. And the emphasis there is very much on making sure that that cognitive profile is linked to intervention. Sometimes when we do, the look at the non-verbal and the verbal reasoning element, that's okay. But often it doesn't lead us to say, well, if there are weaknesses in those areas, what can we do?
Mm,
Equally, if there are strengths in those areas, how can we encourage a pupil to use those strengths? So what I'm going to be talking about quite a bit is how to make those links to intervention. And there'll be lots of handouts, hopefully, that will be supportive. So there'll be things like a list of thinking skills, an example report. There'll be some ideas for supporting executive function and links to specific elements of basic skills, such as how reading comprehension, for example, involves a range of cognitive thinking skills and executive function that we can use to inform use the cognitive profile element to feed into support for the particular areas of weakness. So, if it's dyslexia assessment, it might be reading and spelling. If it's dyscalculia, it
mm.
might be maths.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was very well received. So hopefully it was well received this time as
Good.
well.
I do hope so. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for your support and your help and clarifying all the information. Thank you much indeed.
Thank you very much for asking me, Kevin. It's been a
Thank you.
pleasure talking
You're
to
welcome.
you. Thank you.
And you. Thank you.